My parents secretly planned a tropical vacation without me just to keep my sister happy. Then, they had the audacity to send me a $6,200 Venmo request for my share. So I sent them exactly $1, booked the VIP suite at their exact resort, and let them watch me live my best life from their downgraded room. For an entire spring, my family had talked about St. Lucia like it was a magical reset button. It had been a long, grueling year for everyone, and this trip was supposed to be our chance to feel like a normal, happy family again. We had group chats dedicated to excursion links, restaurant menus, and packing lists. I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously folding linen pants and swimsuits into my suitcase, matching my outfits to the itinerary my mother had printed out and pinned to her fridge. The plan was simple: my parents, my older sister Emma, her husband Mark, and me, 5 adults, 1 shared luxury villa, 7 days of sun. The night before our flight, I drove over to my parents' house to drop off some travel-sized toiletries my mom had asked for. I didn't bother knocking, I just unlocked the front door and walked in. That was my first mistake. The house was quiet, but right there by the stairs, the luggage was already lined up. I counted the bags, 4 large suitcases, 2 carry-ons. I looked at the hallway table. 4 passports were stacked neatly next to a pair of sunglasses. I walked into the living room. Emma was sprawled on the couch, laughing at something on her phone, completely unbothered. From the kitchen, my mother let out a heavy, exhausted sigh as soon as she saw me. Behind her, my father stood at the stove, his back to me, aggressively stirring a pot of pasta sauce that absolutely did not need stirring. "Where's the rest of the luggage?" I asked, my voice dropping a little. My mother wiped her hands on a dish towel and wouldn't meet my eyes. "Chloe, honey, you were not on the final guest list. We figured you'd be fine alone." The air in the room felt suddenly very thin. Emma didn't even look up from her phone. Her laughter just continued, a soft, mocking soundtrack to my humiliation. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. My mother sighed again, that long, put-upon sound she always made when I was being difficult. "Emma has been having a really rough time lately at work. And she just wanted this trip to be about her and Mark. No tension. No stress. Just peace." Apparently, I counted as tension and stress. She went on to explain that Emma and I hadn't been getting along perfectly, which was true only because I had recently stopped letting Emma borrow my car without asking, and that everyone had agreed this dynamic would just be easier. Emma never got off the couch. Mark, who had been sitting in the dining room the whole time, suddenly found the grain of the wooden table utterly fascinating. He said absolutely nothing. It hit me then, like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a last-minute, panicked change of plans. They had planned around me for weeks. They had let me keep packing. They had let me talk about the snorkeling trip I was so excited about. They had nodded and smiled while actively excluding me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't ask them to reconsider or beg for my spot back. I just slowly nodded, turned around, and walked out the front door. I sat behind the steering wheel of my car in their driveway for nearly 20 minutes. I wasn't feeling anger yet. I was feeling something much colder and much worse. Profound, suffocating embarrassment. All those vague conversations from the past month suddenly made perfect sense. "We're still confirming the villa details. We'll let you know. The flights are getting a bit complicated." I had assumed they were just being their usual disorganized selves. In reality, they had been highly organized enough to build an entire luxury vacation around my absence. I drove home in silence. At exactly 10:47 that night, as I was staring blankly at my half-packed suitcase, my phone buzzed. It was a Venmo request from my mother. $6,200. The note attached read, "Your share of the flights and the villa deposit. Love you." I stared at the glowing screen until my vision blurred, and then, completely against my will, I started laughing. It was a harsh, scraping sound in my empty apartment. They did not want me on this trip. They had actively plotted to remove me from it, but they still fully expected me to subsidize it. That was the dynamic of our family in a nutshell. I was the bank, the emotional punching bag, the afterthought. I hit decline on the request. Then, I opened a new transaction, selected my mother's profile, and sent her exactly $1. My note read, "You'll have a surprise." I didn't wait for her response. I opened my laptop, pulled up the airline website, and found the exact flight number I had heard my father mention a few weeks earlier. By some absolute miracle, there was one single seat left in economy. I booked it immediately. Same departure time, same terminal, same gate, same island. But then I started looking at accommodations, and I found something infinitely better than what they had planned. Their reservation was at a sprawling, crowded family resort, one shared villa for 4 adults, right next to the noisy main pool. Farther up the exact same stretch of coastline was the resort's ultra-exclusive sister property. It featured private oceanfront cabanas, separate VIP entrances, infinity pools that vanished into the horizon, and direct, private beach access. One premium beachfront unit had just opened up due to a last-minute cancellation. I booked it under the name Chloe Bennett. In the special requests box, I added a little note: the Bennett family prefers early check-in and a bottle of chilled champagne upon arrival. Was it petty? Absolutely. But after 26 years of being told to make myself smaller, quieter, and less demanding whenever Emma needed the spotlight, I wanted 7 days where nobody could debate whether or not I deserved a seat at the table. Update 1. I got to the airport 3 hours early the next morning. I wore a massive oversized hoodie, kept the hood pulled up, and hid behind dark sunglasses. Near the gate, I spotted them almost immediately. My father had his ancient, cracked leather travel folder tucked importantly under one arm. My mother was nervously checking her watch every 30 seconds. Emma had a ridiculous, oversized designer neck pillow looped through her suitcase handle, while Mark leaned over her shoulder, looking exhausted before the trip had even begun. I waited until they were deeply distracted. My father was actively arguing with a gate agent about overhead bin space, and then I slipped past them in boarding group 4. Nobody noticed me. I took my middle seat several rows behind them, put on my noise-canceling headphones, pulled my hood down over my eyes, and slept through the entire 5-hour flight. When we landed in St. Lucia, I stayed glued to my seat until I saw them exit the plane. I gave them a 10-minute head start. In the arrivals hall, a driver in a crisp white shirt was holding a tablet that read, "Bennett, VIP." He smoothly loaded my bags into an air-conditioned black SUV, handed me an ice-cold towel scented with eucalyptus, and offered me a bottle of water. 30 minutes later, I was standing inside a sprawling cabana with floor-to-ceiling glass doors facing the impossibly blue Caribbean Ocean. I had a private mahogany deck, a woven hammock strung between 2 palm trees, and my own infinity pool. The woman at the VIP reception desk handed me a glass of champagne and smiled warmly. "Welcome to paradise, Miss Bennett. Everything is perfectly ready for you and your guests." I took a sip of the champagne and almost corrected her. Instead, I just smiled back. "Oh, they'll be joining later." My family was at the connected main resort, about a 10-minute walk farther down the beach. That evening, as the sun started to set, I decided to take a stroll toward their side of the massive property, staying just far enough away in the shadows of the palm trees so I wouldn't be spotted. I saw all 4 of them clustered near the chaotic main front desk. They looked sweaty, tired, and deeply irritated. Their luggage was piled haphazardly around them. Emma was talking loudly, using sharp, dramatic hand gestures. My mother looked like she was on the verge of tears, clutching her purse to her chest. A stressed-looking staff member kept bowing his head and apologizing profusely. From what I pieced together later from a chatty bartender, the resort's automated system had seen my special request. It had attached the Bennett VIP note to the First Times Bennett reservation that checked in that day, which was mine. Because the resort was overbooked, when my family finally arrived, their requested villa had been downgraded due to an inventory problem. They still had a room, but they had absolutely no premium ocean view, no beachside placement, and none of the luxury extras they had been bragging about for months. They were shoved into a standard suite overlooking the parking lot. I didn't cause the hotel error, but I absolutely did not volunteer to walk over and fix it. I turned around, walked back to my silent, perfect cabana, ordered a massive plate of fresh seafood from room service, and slept with the glass doors cracked open so I could hear the waves crashing against the shore. The first morning felt completely unreal. There was no family chatter. No one was asking me to apologize to Emma for breathing too loudly. No one was demanding I make them coffee. It was just fresh mangoes, dark coffee, warm island air, and the sound of the ocean. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel like a minor character orbiting the sun of Emma's drama. At 9:38 a.m., my phone lit up. A text from my mother: "Did you do something with our reservation? The hotel is being impossible." I swiped the notification away and ignored it. 10 minutes later, Emma followed. "We need to talk right now. Something weird is going on with the villa and they said someone named Bennett already claimed the VIP perks. What did you do?" Then came a 2-minute voice message from her, that I immediately deleted without opening. By noon, my father called. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Did you book something under our name?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. "Under my time's name," I corrected smoothly, adjusting my sunglasses, as I looked out at the water. "Why the hell are you here, Chloe?" he snapped. I took a slow sip of my iced coffee and repeated my mother's exact sentence from the kitchen. "I figured you'd be fine alone." He went dead silent. I could hear the faint sound of resort music in the background on his end. Then, the line clicked dead. That afternoon, I decided to fully embrace my solo trip. I booked a deep tissue massage and then wandered over to the outdoor bar, where I ended up sitting next to 2 travelers, Noah and Zach. Their own massive group trip had completely fallen apart due to canceled flights, so they had decided to just drink tequila and enjoy the island anyway. We ended up talking for hours, completely platonically, about the nightmare of family planning, toxic dynamics, and the strange, Unexpected relief of realizing a ruined plan could still become a phenomenal memory. The next day, the inevitable happened. I crossed paths with Emma near a crowded beachside grill. She was violently sunburned, peeling on her nose, and looked absolutely furious. I was wearing a breezy linen shirt over my swimsuit, fresh from a morning of paddleboarding, holding a frozen cocktail. She stopped dead in the sand. Our eyes met. The air between us practically crackled with tension. Neither of us spoke a single word. I just raised my eyebrows behind my sunglasses, took a sip of my drink, and kept walking right past her. And in that exact moment, I realized something profound. I was no longer waiting for them to invite me back into the family. I didn't care anymore. On the fourth morning, there was a soft knock on my cabana door. A woman from the resort staff handed me a sealed white envelope. "A guest at the main property asked us to deliver this to you, Miss Bennett," she said politely. There was no name on the front, just Emma's room number scribbled aggressively in the corner. I opened it while standing on my deck. Inside were 3 short sentences in my sister's messy handwriting. "This has gone way too far. Everyone is embarrassed for you. You ruined the trip." I read it twice, not because it hurt, but because I was genuinely trying to understand her delusional logic. They times had deliberately removed me times from a family vacation. They times had tried to make me pay for it. Yet, somehow, my mere existence on the same landmass was ruining their time. I folded the letter, placed it beneath my coffee cup so the ocean breeze wouldn't blow it away, and went back to reading my book. That afternoon, Noah and Zach convinced me to join a small reef tour run by a retired marine biologist. For almost 6 hours, my phone stayed buried at the bottom of my beach bag. We snorkeled beside massive sea turtles, ate fresh pineapple on the deck of the boat, and anchored near a stretch of pristine coastline where there were no hotels or tourists at all. Zach took a candid picture while Noah and I were laughing hysterically at something the guide had said. Later, another picture caught all 3 of us sitting on the edge of the boat, the sun setting behind us, looking happier than I had in years. Zach posted it on Instagram and tagged me. I barely thought about it. Apparently, my family thought about nothing else. By the time the boat docked and I checked my phone, I had 5 missed calls from my father. His text message read, "Delete those pictures right now. You are deliberately humiliating this family on social media. People are asking questions." Emma sent another one immediately afterward. "So this is all some kind of desperate performance? You had to find random guys to hang out with? You're pathetic, Chloe." But it was my mother's message that stayed with me the longest. It read, "We have supported you your entire life. You were always a difficult child, but we never treated you like you were a burden. I don't understand what happened to you to make you this cruel." I sat on the edge of my pristine, white hotel bed, rereading that sentence over and over. Supported you. My parents absolutely loved that word. Every single compromise they had ever demanded of me was labeled support. Every time I was told to let Emma have the bigger bedroom, the better car, the first choice of colleges because she needed it more, that was their version of support. Every birthday where my plans were abruptly changed because Emma was going through a breakup or a crisis. Every holiday where I was forced to apologize first just because my parents wanted peace in the house. Every conversation where my mother told me I was strong enough to handle it, it was all weaponized. Support. That evening, Noah and Zach went into the local town to find some live music, but I decided to stay behind at the resort. I walked barefoot along the edge of the property, letting the cool water wash over my feet until the bright resort lights disappeared behind me. Near a low stone wall overlooking the crashing waves, I noticed a solitary figure sitting in the dark, holding a beer. It was Mark, Emma's husband. He looked entirely drained, staring out at the black water. When he heard my footsteps, he turned, saw me, and raised his beer bottle slightly in a gesture that looked almost apologetic. I considered turning around and walking back to my room, but instead, I walked over and sat down on the wall a few feet away from him. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind and the ocean. Finally, Mark let out a heavy sigh, keeping his eyes on the waves. "They're completely falling apart over there, you know." I shrugged, pulling my sweater tighter around my shoulders. "That sounds unfortunate." He gave a dry, tired laugh. "Your mom cried for 2 hours this afternoon. Your dad is pacing the room and barely talking. Emma keeps picking fights with the staff, with me, with anyone who looks at her wrong." Then, Mark took a slow sip of his beer and said something that changed my entire perspective on the trip. "They honestly thought you'd stay home, Chloe." I turned my head to look at him. "What?" He rubbed the damp label on his beer bottle with his thumb, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Emma thought you'd be upset for a few days, maybe send some angry texts, ignore her calls. But she told your parents, Chloe always comes around eventually. She'll get over it by the time we get back." I asked the question I had been carrying inside me since the moment I walked into my parents' house and saw the luggage. Was leaving me out really Emma's idea? Mark hesitated. And that brief hesitation answered me before his words ever could. "Yeah," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It started with her. She told your parents she couldn't possibly enjoy the vacation if she had to spend 7 days worrying about whether you were going to start a fight with her and your parents. They just thought excluding you was easier than forcing the two of you to actually sit down and deal with things. I stared out at the dark water, letting the reality of it wash over me. There had never been a booking mistake. There had never been limited space in the villa. Nobody had forgotten to tell me anything. 4 grown adults had sat around a table, discussed whether I deserved to be part of the family, and collectively decided that I did not. And you? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Mark swallowed hard. I should have said something. I told them it was a bad idea, but I didn't stop it. It wasn't a real apology, but at least it was the truth. After another long stretch of silence, he spoke again. I probably shouldn't tell you this either, but they're going to come after you hard when we get home. Your dad keeps talking about how you've disrespected him. Your mom thinks you embarrassed them publicly with those photos. Emma is convinced you did all of this specifically to punish her. Emma. I stood up, brushing the sand off my legs. They can think whatever they want, Mark. It doesn't matter to me anymore. He nodded slowly, looking up at me. Yeah. I'm starting to realize that. The next morning, Emma was waiting for me. She was standing squarely on the narrow wooden path that connected the two resorts. There was absolutely no avoiding her this time. As I approached, she stepped directly into my path, crossing her arms over her chest. Are you enjoying yourself? She asked, her voice dripping with venom. Immensely, I replied. My simple, unbothered answer seemed to irritate her more than if I had screamed in her face. You know, Mom has barely slept since we got here because of your little stunt. I looked her dead in the eyes. And whose idea was it to leave me behind in the first place, Emma? Her expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Mark had warned me without realizing he had given me something much more valuable than insider information. He had given me confirmation. I held all the cards now. Emma quickly recovered, her face twisting into a scowl. This is exactly why nobody wanted you here, Chloe. Everything with you has to become some massive confrontation. You're impossible to be around. I actually laughed. A real, genuine laugh. You deliberately excluded me so there wouldn't be a confrontation, Emma. And now you're literally following me down a beach path, blocking my way, demanding one. You're exhausting. She opened her mouth, her face turning an angry shade of red, but I didn't wait to hear what came out. I stepped off the path, walked around her through the sand, and kept going. Update 2. The flight home felt completely different from the flight there. I boarded before my family again and took a window seat near the back of the plane. When they finally entered the cabin, I watched them walk down the aisle. I saw how utterly defeated they looked. My mother's shoulders were slumped and tense. My father carried his leather folder without his usual arrogant confidence. Emma and Mark walked several steps apart, not looking at each other. Nobody was laughing. I expected to feel a deep sense of satisfaction. I had won, after all. I had outplayed them. But there wasn't any satisfaction. As I watched Saint Lucia disappear beneath the clouds outside my window, I felt almost nothing. A hollow, quiet emptiness, and that surprised me more than their anger ever had. I had spent years of my life imagining how good it would feel if my family finally understood how badly they had hurt me. Now, sitting on that plane, I realized I didn't need them to understand anymore. I just needed to be away from them. 2 days after we returned to the city, my phone chimed. A text from my mother: we are pausing all communication with you until you are ready to acknowledge how badly you behaved on this trip. My father followed up an hour later: we hope you use this time of silence to reflect on the severe damage you have caused to this family. Then, another Venmo request appeared on my screen. This time, it was for $18,500. The note read: covering the flights, the accommodation change fees, and the additional expenses caused by your selfish disruptions. I stared at it, shook my head, and hit deny. 10 minutes later, they sent it again. I denied it again, and then I went into my phone settings and permanently blocked both of their accounts. Emma reacted very differently. The silence rule apparently didn't apply to her. She began texting me constantly, day and night. Hope your little resort stunt was worth losing your entire family. Do you really think you won something? You've always been a selfish brat. Don't expect this to just disappear. Some nights, she would send 4 or 5 unhinged voice messages in a row. I deleted every single one of them without listening. A week later, my father emailed me with the subject line: family boundaries going forward. I archived it without opening it. My mother unfollowed me on every social media platform. Emma continued messaging until I finally muted her, and then blocked her number entirely. At work, my colleagues asked how the Caribbean had been. I smiled softly and simply said, quiet. Exactly what I needed. Noah and Zach stayed in touch for a few months, mostly sending funny memes and pictures from our snorkeling trip, but nothing needed to become a lifelong bond. They had served their purpose in my life. They had simply reminded me that being around other people could feel easy and light, without conditions or walking on eggshells. By the end of that month, I deleted the Bennett family group chat. Then, I opened the digital calendar on my laptop and began removing every single family event. Mom's birthday, Dad's birthday, Emma and Mark's anniversary, Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas Eve, my parents' annual summer brunch. One by one, I clicked delete, watching them vanish from the screen. For years, those dates had felt like heavy obligations carved into stone, chains tying me to a dynamic that was drowning me. Watching them disappear felt almost ceremonial, a cleansing. By October, nearly 3 months had passed without a single real conversation with anyone in my family. In November, I received a handwritten letter in the mail from my mother. She wrote that she hoped I was safe. She wrote that she could not understand how one single vacation had created such an ugly, unnecessary division. She ended by saying that forgiveness was always possible if I was willing to sit down and admit my part in destroying the family. I folded the letter neatly, placed it inside the bottom drawer of my nightstand, and closed it. I did not write back. Thanksgiving came and went, Christmas came, then my birthday. I spent all of them with a close group of friends. There were no arguments. There were no silent treatments. There were no stressful seating arrangements, and nobody pulled me aside to ask me to keep Emma happy. It was just food, laughter, and peace. And sometimes, usually late at night when the apartment was completely silent, I would think about that first morning in St. Lucia, the empty, pristine beach, the quiet ocean, and the strange, beautiful realization that nobody had given me peace. I had simply stopped asking them for permission to have it. Almost a full year passed before I realized that entire weeks were going by without me thinking about my family at all. At first, the silence had felt like a fragile glass wall that I had to actively protect. I would see an unfamiliar phone number ring on my screen and my heart would hammer, wondering if my mother was calling from a stranger's phone. An email notification would make my stomach tighten into knots because I fully expected another multi-paragraph lecture from my father. But eventually, the physical reaction stopped. Life just kept moving forward, regardless of whether my parents approved of me or not. I moved out of my old place, found a smaller, sunlit apartment closer to the coast with huge windows, and picked up more freelance design work alongside my regular job. I put enough physical distance between myself and my parents' neighborhood that I no longer had panic attacks about running into them at the grocery store. Most importantly, I started sleeping normally again. There was no grand, cinematic moment when everything magically became better. I simply woke up one morning, looked at the clock, and realized I had slept 8 solid hours without waking up grinding my teeth in anger. I was also seeing someone. His name was Ethan. We met at a small, pretentious downtown art gallery opening after one of my coworkers practically dragged me there for the free wine. Ethan was standing next to a massive, chaotic painting of what looked like red squares splashing into a black void. Neither of us understood it. When I stepped up next to him and jokingly asked if he knew what it was supposed to mean, he didn't miss a beat. "Absolutely," he said with a completely straight face, "but I'm charging $25 for the explanation. It's premium knowledge." That was how it started. Coffee turned into long dinners. Dinners turned into weekends spent exploring the city together. Ethan knew early on that I was completely estranged from my family, but he never treated it like a tragic mystery he was entitled to solve. When I eventually told him that a disaster of a trip to St. Lucia had been the final breaking point, he just looked at me quietly and asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" When I shook my head and said, "Not really," he just nodded, kissed my forehead, and changed the subject to what we were ordering for dinner. It was such an incredibly small thing, but after 26 years of people demanding explanations, apologies, and compromises from me, being allowed to just keep something painful private felt strangely intimate. Then, on a rainy Tuesday night around 8:30 p.m., someone knocked heavily on my apartment door. Ethan was working late at his firm. I hadn't ordered any food, and nobody I knew visited without texting first. I assumed it was one of my neighbors needing to borrow something or complaining about a leak. I unbolted the door and pulled it open. Emma was standing in the hallway. For several long seconds, my brain genuinely did not register who she was. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven ponytail, dyed a much darker brown than I remembered. She was wearing an oversized, faded windbreaker that I had seen hanging in our parents' closet hundreds of times when we were teenagers. There was no perfect makeup, no polished, arrogant expression, no immediate irritation waiting behind her eyes. She just looked incredibly tired. Not dramatically destroyed, not weeping, just like the gravity of life had been much heavier than she ever expected. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched until it felt suffocating. Finally, Emma swallowed hard and looked at my shoes. "Mom's in the hospital." Whatever defensive, angry speech I might have imagined giving her if she ever showed up at my door completely evaporated. My hands went cold. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Heart attack," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Mild. They caught it in time. The doctors think she'll recover, but it was close." She paused, looking up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "She asked for you." I stayed rooted in the doorway, my hand gripping the doorknob so hard my knuckles were white. My mother had become almost abstract to me over the last year, a ghost who existed only in old photographs, blocked phone numbers, and unopened letters in my drawer. Hearing that she was currently lying in a sterile hospital bed, hooked up to machines, suddenly made her violently real again in a way I hadn't emotionally prepared for. Emma seemed to read the intense hesitation and suspicion on my face, because she quickly took a step back and held up her hands. "I'm not here to manipulate you, Chloe, I swear. I'm just telling you what happened." Then, she reached into the deep pocket of her windbreaker and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. I took it cautiously. It was hotel, stationery, strangely enough, probably something my mother had hoarded from a recent weekend trip. There was only one single sentence written across the center of the page, in my mother's unmistakable, looping handwriting: "If I was wrong, I'm sorry. I love you either way." I stared at the ink. There was no massive paragraph explaining why she had actually been right all along. There was no mention of my bad behavior. There was no demand for me to apologize first. I turned the paper over, almost expecting a hidden list of conditions on the back. It was blank. "She wrote that?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. Emma nodded, hugging her arms across her chest. This afternoon, she couldn't really talk much after they moved her from the ICU, so she asked a nurse for a pen. I looked at my sister, still deeply suspicious of the entire situation. "Why didn't Dad come to tell me?" Emma let out a long, shuddering breath. "Because Dad still thinks this can all be fixed by everyone sitting around a big table and formally agreeing that mistakes were made on both sides. He wanted to draft an email." That sounded exactly like him. "And you?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Why are you here?" She stared at the hallway floor, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know anymore." That answer caught me completely off guard. Emma had always times known. She knew when I was being difficult. She knew when Mom was protecting me too much. She knew when Dad needed respect. She knew exactly why excluding me from St. Point 5. Lucia had been a necessary and brilliant idea. Absolute certainty had always been one of her favorite, most lethal weapons. Now, she looked at me, stripped of all her armor, and said quietly, "She's scared you won't come, Chloe." I almost replied that maybe Mom should be scared, but Emma continued before I could form the words. "Not because she thinks you're still holding a grudge," Emma clarified softly. "She thinks maybe you've actually just moved on. That you don't need us at all." The hallway went completely, incredibly still. For the first time in our entire lives, my sister was not accusing me of abandoning the family out of spite. She was acknowledging, out loud, that I might have successfully built a life that simply no longer had an empty space waiting for them to fill. I cleared my throat. "How did you get here? Did you drive?" "Ride share," she said, shoving her hands deep into her pockets. "My car is in the shop." The old Emma would have complained for 20 minutes straight about the indignity of being without her luxury SUV, the smell of the Uber, and the inconvenience of the rain. This version of Emma just stood there, accepting it. "I'm going back to the hospital," she said, taking a step toward the elevator. She didn't ask if I was coming with her. She didn't try to guilt-trip me by saying Mom needed me. She didn't drop the classic family is family line. She just turned away. But right before she reached the stairwell, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "For what it's worth, Chloe, I shouldn't have asked them to leave you out of the trip." My grip tightened around the hotel stationery in my hand. Emma didn't turn around fully to face me. "I thought if you weren't there, everything would be easier," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't. It's been a nightmare ever since." Then, she pushed open the heavy fire door and walked away. I closed my apartment door, locked the deadbolt, and walked into my kitchen. I sat at the small wooden table with the note placed perfectly in front of me. For almost an hour, I did absolutely nothing but stare at it. I tried to picture walking into the sterile hospital room and seeing my mother hooked up to IVs. Would she immediately take the apology back? Would my dad instantly start talking about reconciliation timelines? Would Emma's sudden, shocking honesty survive once everyone was back in the same room together? I didn't know. And underneath all of those logical, protective questions was another, much quieter truth that I hated admitting to myself. What if I wanted to go? Not because I had forgotten St. Lucia, or the 26 years of being second best before it. Not because a medical emergency magically erased the fact that they had treated me like garbage, but because, somewhere underneath all the anger, the distance, and the boundaries, she was still my mother. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Ethan. "Just left the office. Want me to come over and bring Thai food?" I stared at the glowing message for a long time before my fingers started typing. "Not tonight, family thing came up. Weird day." His reply came 30 seconds later. "Okay. I'm here if you need me. Take your time." Nothing else. No interrogation about my sudden change of heart. No demand that I make the right choice about my toxic family. Just space. I placed my phone down beside the note and sat there, listening to the rain hit the window glass. A year earlier, my family had decided what I needed without ever asking me. They decided I could handle being left alone. They decided Emma deserved peace more than I deserved honesty. Then, when I stopped participating in their games, they decided what my silence meant, too. I was selfish, cruel, angry, vindictive. Maybe the biggest, most profound change in me was that I no longer felt the burning need to prove any of those descriptions wrong. I did not go to the hospital that night, I did not call my father. I did not unblock Emma's phone number. But I also did not throw away my mother's note. The next morning, it was still sitting on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left it, folded once down the middle. I made my coffee and stared at it while the morning sunlight moved slowly across the quartz counter. Maybe I would visit her. Maybe I wouldn't. Maybe forgiveness would eventually mean letting them back into my life in small doses. Or maybe, forgiveness would only mean remembering them without feeling my chest tighten in panic. For the first time in my life, I truly understood that reconciliation was not something they could demand simply because they were finally ready for it. The note stayed on my table, waiting. And for now, that was enough. 3 days after Emma came to my apartment, I finally went to the hospital. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't want a welcoming committee. I found my mother's room number at the front desk, rode the elevator up to the cardiac floor, and stood outside her heavy wooden door for almost 5 full minutes, regulating my breathing before pushing it open. My mother was asleep. She looked incredibly frail, much smaller than I remembered, surrounded by a maze of clear tubes and the quiet, rhythmic electronic beeping of the heart monitors. My father was sitting in a vinyl chair near the window, reading a magazine. When he looked up and saw me, he stood up so fast he almost knocked the chair over. "Chloe." I immediately raised a hand, stopping him before he could start a speech. "I'm just here to see Mom, Dad, that's it." His jaw tightened, and I saw the familiar flash of defensive anger in his eyes, but for once, he swallowed it. He didn't argue. I'll go get a coffee," he muttered, slipping past me and out the door. I sat down in the warm chair he had just vacated beside my mother's bed. Looking at her pale face, I realized something I should have understood years earlier. I could genuinely care that she had nearly died without pretending she had never hurt me. Loving someone did not require surrendering every single boundary the moment they experienced a crisis. 20 minutes later, her eyelids fluttered, and she slowly opened her eyes. She blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, her gaze drifting until it landed on me. "Chloe." Her voice was a dry rasp. "Hi, Mom." Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, spilling over her wrinkles and into her hair. "You came." "I did." She looked nervously toward the closed door. "Emma told you?" "She came to your apartment. I told her not to pressure you. I told her just to tell you." "She didn't pressure me," I said softly. My mother seemed to deflate with relief. We sat in a heavy, loaded silence for several minutes, the only sound the steady times beep 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 times of the machine tracking her pulse. Finally, she turned her head toward me. "Did you get my note?" "Yes, I did. I meant it." I studied her face, looking for the catch. "Which part?" "All of it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Especially the part where I said I was wrong." I had heard various versions of apologies from my family before. They were always apologies followed by a but, explanations, excuses, and immediate reminders of what I had supposedly done to trigger their actions. I wasn't interested in another one of those. "Wrong about what, Mom?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "St. Lucia, leaving you behind. Asking you to pay for it afterward. The terrible things we said when we came home." She paused, closing her eyes as a fresh tear slipped out. "And, before, St. Lucia." That caught me off guard. My defensive walls faltered slightly. My mother looked down at her hands, where an IV was taped to her bruised skin. "I spent 20 years telling myself you were just the easier child. Emma needed so much more attention. She got upset so easily, she demanded so much energy. You always adapted. You never complained. So I just let you adapt." "I didn't adapt, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the quiet room like a knife. "I gave up." She squeezed her eyes shut. "I know that now. Sitting in this bed. I know." I didn't tell her I forgave her. I wasn't ready to say those words, and maybe forgiveness wasn't something that needed to happen in one dramatic moment in a hospital room. Instead, I asked the question that was bothering me. "Why now, Mom? Why the note?" "Because I got terrified," she admitted, opening her eyes to look at me pleadingly. "When the paramedics were loading me into the ambulance, my chest felt like it was crushing me. I kept thinking about the people I wanted to see if I survived. I thought about you. And I realized, with absolute certainty, that I didn't know if you would even come to my funeral." Her voice cracked, a devastating sound. "And I knew I couldn't even blame you if you didn't." Something deep inside my chest shifted. It didn't heal, the scars didn't magically vanish, but the heavy, frozen block of resentment cracked just a little. "I almost didn't come," I told her honestly. "I know," she whispered. Before I stood up to leave, she reached out with a trembling hand, not quite touching my arm. Can I call you? After they let me go home? Maybe. I said. She nodded, pulling her hand back. Okay. No guilt trip, no argument, no tearful reminder that she was my mother and I owed her my time. Just, okay. When I walked out into the hallway, my father was waiting near the elevator banks holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. He held one out to me awkwardly. I wasn't sure how you take it anymore. But, black is fine, I said, taking it. We stood there in the sterile corridor, the silence stretching between us like a physical wall. Finally, he cleared his throat. Chloe, we should really sit down and talk about all of this. Not today, Dad, I said firmly, stepping back. His jaw tightened. Chloe, we need to clear the air. I said not today. I held his gaze, refusing to back down. For a terrifying second, I expected the old lecture. The booming voice demanding respect. The lecture about family hierarchy. Instead, his shoulders dropped, and he gave a slow, defeated nod. All right, not today. That tiny, reluctant concession meant more to me than any dramatic, weeping apology ever could have. My mother was discharged and went home the following week. She called me once, on a Sunday afternoon, and kept the conversation incredibly simple. We talked about her new medication, her annoying cardiac rehabilitation exercises, and how terrible the hospital food had been. She didn't ask when I was visiting. She didn't tell me Emma was crying and needed me. She didn't try to arrange a massive family summit. A month later, Mom and I met for coffee at a small cafe halfway between our apartments. It was awkward at first, but eventually, she took a sip of her tea and said, "Your father really wants to see you." I instantly stiffened, my walls shooting right back up. "I'm not asking you to see him." She added quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm just telling you because he asked me to. I am actively trying to stop managing everybody's relationships for them." I blinked, surprised, and then a small smile broke across my face. "How's that going for you?" "Terribly," she sighed, shaking her head. We both laughed. It was the first genuine, unburdened laugh we had shared in over 5 years. Then, her face grew serious, and she told me that Emma had finally admitted to them exactly how the St. Dave, Lucia exclusion had started. "I told her it doesn't excuse what your father and I did," Mom said quietly, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "We were the parents. We were the adults. When she said she wanted you off the trip, we should have told her absolutely not." "Yes," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "You should have." "I know." That afternoon became the fragile beginning of whatever new relationship my mother and I were going to rebuild. It wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about acknowledging it and holding them accountable. Emma took much longer to come around. 2 full months passed before she finally emailed me. The subject line was, "No response required." Inside, she wrote a long, surprisingly self-aware message. She wrote that she had spent most of her life genuinely believing our parents expected me to compromise because they trusted me more, because I was stronger. She had never stopped to consider that being the easy child just meant my needs were infinitely easier to ignore. She admitted that she had constantly punished me for resentments that actually belonged between her and our parents. She ended the email with this, "I think I spent years making you pay for things I was actually angry at Mom and Dad about. St. Lucia was just the absolute worst example of it. I'm sorry." I waited 2 full days to process it before I replied with a single sentence, "Thank you for saying that." My father, shockingly, surprised me the most. His first attempt at an email was exactly what I had expected. 4 dense paragraphs about how difficult the situation had been for everyone involved, and how miscommunications had caused pain. I replied immediately, telling him that I wasn't interested in discussing everyone until he could sit down and clearly acknowledge what times he personally had done. 3 weeks of silence followed. And then, another email arrived in my inbox. "I stood in the kitchen while your mother told you that you weren't coming to street. Lucia." I knew what she was going to say before you walked in. I said nothing because I was a coward and I didn't want to deal with another screaming match with Emma. "Then, I allowed us to ask you to pay for a vacation we deliberately excluded you from. That was cowardly, it was cruel, and it was wrong. I failed to protect you. I am deeply sorry, Chloe." I sat at my desk and cried after reading it. Not because everything was magically fixed, but because for the first time in his life, my father hadn't hidden behind corporate buzzwords like times misunderstanding, disrespect, or times both sides. I replied with 2 words. "Thank you." Months slowly bled into years. My family never transformed into the perfect, glowing family people expect at the end of heartwarming movies. We were still fractured. My mother and I began having lunch every few weeks, keeping things light but honest. Emma and I slowly started texting again, mostly after she and Mark filed for separation and she had to learn how to live alone. My father and I remained much more distant, speaking mostly on holidays, although even he gradually learned that hearing me say no did not mean he was being personally attacked. One rainy afternoon, Emma and I found ourselves alone in our mother's kitchen, chopping vegetables for a holiday dinner. Out of nowhere, she stopped cutting a lemon and looked at me. "Do you ever think about St. Lucia?" she asked. "Sometimes," I admitted, continuing to chop. "Do you?" "Me too." She stared at the cutting board, a rueful smile on her face. "I hated you so much on that trip, Chloe." I raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Yeah, I kind of noticed." She laughed, a dry, self-deprecating sound. "Every time I saw you walking down the beach enjoying yourself, I got angrier. I convinced myself you were doing it at times me. Like you were aggressively relaxing just to spite me." "Well, to be fair, some of it was absolutely at you," I admitted. "Booking the VIP reservation and stealing your perks wasn't exactly an innocent accident." Emma smiled, shaking her head. "Honestly, that was kind of impressive. Evil, but impressive." Then, her expression softened and became serious. "But eventually, after we got home, I realized you weren't ruining our vacation. We were ruining it ourselves. None of us could stand the fact that you weren't miserable without us." That sentence stayed with me for a long time, because she was absolutely right. They had expected me to stay home, angry, hurt, and pathetic, waiting by the phone for them to return so we could eventually resume our toxic roles. My happiness, my independence, threatened the core story they told themselves, that I needed them far more than they needed me. I wasn't trying to prove I didn't need you guys, I told her quietly. I was just trying to prove it to myself. Emma nodded slowly. "I know." 3 years after that original disastrous trip, Ethan and I were sitting on our couch, planning a vacation. He turned to me and asked where I wanted to go for my birthday. Without even thinking, I blurted out, "Anywhere except St. Lucia." But then I stopped. I looked at him. Why not St. Lucia? My family didn't own those beaches just because they had been the setting for our worst fight. They didn't own the ocean. So, Ethan and I booked the tickets. We went back. Different island side, different resort, no secret bookings, no family drama, no need for petty revenge. Just us. On our second morning there, we rented a Jeep and drove along the winding coast until we found a nearly empty, stunning stretch of beach. Standing there, feeling the warm sand between my toes, I remembered my first morning in St. Lucia years earlier. I remembered drinking coffee alone on that deck while angry, toxic messages piled up on my phone, threatening to ruin me. Back then, I thought freedom meant nobody could ever reach me. I thought it meant building walls so high I was completely isolated. Now, standing next to Ethan, I understood it differently. True freedom meant people could reach me, but they could no longer control me. It meant I could say yes because I genuinely wanted to, not because someone had manipulated me into believing that saying no was a cruel act. My phone buzzed in my beach bag. I pulled it out. Emma had sent me a text message. "Mom says you and Ethan are in St. Lucia for your birthday. Have a drink for me. And don't worry, nobody's sending you a Venmo request this time." I laughed so loudly that a seagull startled and flew away. Ethan looked over, shielding his eyes from the sun. "What's so funny? Should we send her $1? He asked with a grin. "Don't tempt me," I smiled. I snapped a quick photograph of the crystal clear ocean and sent it to Emma. A moment later, 3 typing dots appeared, followed by her reply. "Looks incredibly peaceful." I looked out at the vast, blue water before typing back. "It is, S." That evening, Ethan and I walked along the shoreline as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. My family still wasn't perfect. They probably never would be. My mother still occasionally slipped into her old habits of trying to manage my schedule. My father still occasionally confused respect with blind obedience. Emma and I still knew exactly which words could cut each other the deepest if we ever wanted to use them. And I still, on my worst days, expected every minor disagreement to explode into another St. Lucia. Healing had not magically turned us into entirely different, flawless people. It had simply made it much, much harder for us to lie about who we really were. Years earlier, I had firmly believed that peace would only come when my family finally understood the depth of what they had done to me. Instead, I realized that peace had actually started much sooner than that. It started in my parents' driveway, when my mother told me I wasn't invited, and I got back into my car instead of begging on my knees for a place in their lives. It continued when I booked my own seat, found my own luxury room, and discovered the hard way that being excluded from their plans did not mean being excluded from life. Eventually, some of them found their way back to me. But this time, they came through a door that I controlled. Some days that door was open, some days it was locked tight, but the beauty of it was that nobody else got to decide the rules anymore. Ethan reached over and gently took my hand as the tide moved in, washing across our footprints in the sand behind us. Once upon a time, I might have found it sad, watching those footprints disappear. Now, I understood that some things were supposed to fade away. Old obligations, old, heavy resentments. Old versions of ourselves built entirely around keeping other people comfortable. Somewhere in my bag back at the hotel room, there were text messages waiting from my mother, my father, and Emma wishing me a happy birthday. I could answer them later. Or tomorrow. Or not at all. Nobody was keeping score anymore. Nobody was waiting for me to prove that I belonged. I looked across the ocean, took a deep breath of the salt air, and realized that St. Lucia was no longer the place where my family had abandoned me. It was the place where, years ago, I had finally stopped abandoning myself. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and allows us to bring you even more awesome stories. Thank you so much for watching.